Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar this evening. This is our first joint webinar from Fertility Network UK, the UK Patient Support Network, and Chana, the Fertility Support Network for the Jewish community. This evening we're going to be looking at the recent government changes around storage and consent and what that might mean for you. I'm Kate from Fertility Network, and my co-host this evening is Dr. Veronique Berman from Chana. Just a few bits of housekeeping to start with. We are recording this webinar and you'll be able to access it through our YouTube channel. We'll post on social media once it's there so that you can watch it again if there's anything you want to catch up on. We do have some questions in advance, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat box at the bottom and make sure you address them to the panelist and the host, and then no one else will be able to see them. Don't worry if you don't do that. If you do put them in just generally, we're not going to read out anyone's names. All questions will be completely anonymous, so you can be reassured of that. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Veronique, who's going to introduce our guest this evening.
Thank you very, very much, Kate. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome this evening Rachel Cutting. Rachel graduated from the University of Nottingham in 1995, and she completed the Associate of Clinical Embryologist post-diploma and in her first trainee embryologist position. In 2001, she gained the position of Principal Embryologist at Jessup Fertility in Sheffield, and was the person responsible for 10 years and also quality manager for 16 years. Rachel was chair of the Associate of Clinical Embryologists from 2011 to 2014 and has been involved with several professional bodies and organizations. She was instrumental in writing the curriculum for the reproductive science training program. She has written several papers and chapters and has represented regularly at national and international conferences. Working closely with the HFEA for several years, Rachel was involved in writing the national guidelines for single embryo transfer and was committed to the one-at-a-time strategy to reduce the multiple pregnancy rate following IVF, a very successful strategy. Rachel was a member of the HFEA authority and sat on statutory approval committees until she joined the HFEA as the Director of Compliance and Information in 2019, and has had a very busy time at that. Thank you very, very much, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to introduce you this evening and to invite you to speak about this very important development. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. We're going through quite a period of change at the moment for patients and staff at clinics and for the HFEA. So it's really appreciate the opportunity to share this with patients going through treatment perhaps at the moment, or have got stored material, and just to explain some of the changes to you. Thought it would be useful to start with just to do a short presentation to go through some of the main key changes that are happening at the moment and to try and explain those. I'm just going to ask for a thumbs up, Kate or Veronique, if you can see my slides. Wonderful, thank you. So the key changes that we need to think about really are those for patients, and the main change in the law now is that all patients can store their eggs, sperm or embryos for their own treatment for up to 55 years, but consent has to be renewed every 10 years. And that's a really important fact to remember, that although you can store for that length of time, you have to renew your consent. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. It has changed because under the old legislation, what we've got just changes now, is that it was only patients that were at risk or had become prematurely infertile that could actually store for more than 10 years. And it was very strict, the rules around that. So this new legislation really does give a lot more equal, gives everybody a much better opportunity to store their gametes or embryos. When I mention gametes, that's eggs and sperm. It does give them opportunity to store for as long as they wish for. One of the other main changes in the legislation, and this is often a difficult subject to even want to talk about, but it is important to talk about it when you do store your egg, sperm or embryos. that the new law allows you to consent to use these if you died when those embryos or sperm or eggs are in storage. So you could consent for your partner to use those posthumously. There are different implications if you're in a male-female relationship. If the male passes away, you can simply consent to posthumous use, so that allows your female partner to use them in the event of the death of the male partner. Of course, if it's the other way around, it's a little bit more complicated, because the man can't use them for an own treatment. So the man would have to use those in a surrogacy arrangement. And there's a lot more implications around that to consider for a woman, such as extra screening bloods, which is extra cost for a treatment, and also extra consent forms. So although this is great, it allows everybody to be able to use and consent to use gametes and embryos in the event of death for 10 years, there's a lot of implications to think about. And this is when you might want to think about taking up the offer of counselling that the clinic should offer you, and really think about the information that's provided around this. As I say, this is a difficult issue to think about, but really have those honest conversations with your partner. You've really got to, the only way gametes or embryos can be used posthumously is if that consent is in writing and everything is in place. Your clinics will make detailed notes in their records, but it's that consent form that's really important. And if consent are given, and now in the law, you've got 10 years from the date of death to use those sperm or eggs, create embryos, and use those embryos. Another difference in the law now is that gametes, eggs or sperm, can be stored for research and training purposes as well as embryos. But there's a slight difference in that. Sperm and embryos can be used and stored for training purposes for up to 55 years from the time that they are consented, that they go into storage. So the day that they go into storage for training purposes, a clinic, if you consented to that, you might decide that you only want to consent for 5 years, but you could potentially allow those to be stored for 55 years. It's quite different for embryos, and actually to use embryos in training or research, the date that it goes from is the date the consent is signed, and that's different from sperm and embryos. So that's something that when you are filling consent forms out, the clinic should go through with you and explain the implications of that. There's also changes for donors, and under the old legislation, donors could store for longer than 10 years, but that sperm or eggs or embryos could only be allocated after a 10-year cut-off to those recipients of that were prematurely infertile. Now, any donor can store their material as long as they consent to that for 55 years, and they don't need to renew their consent at all within this 55-year period. But this is where it's really important, if you're considering being a donor or you're having donor material, that you do in your counselling appointments and your implications counselling appointments especially, understand the implications of that. Because there are implications if donor sperm, for example, has been kept in storage a long time. And I'll probably touch on that maybe in the questions later on. So if you want to be a donor, there are things that you need to consider. And obviously the main thing is that you can consent to up to 55 years, and that can be used for everybody, and you don't have to renew consent. So that's very different to where you are with a patient. A patient has to renew consent every 10 years. For anybody who is a donor and donated a long time ago, you could contact your clinic and reconsent to allow for anybody to use that donated material now. So if you're a donor, it might be worth just contacting your clinic and ask about the implications of reconsenting. So some patients might have sperm, eggs or embryos in storage already. And just to talk a little bit through the implications of this. Regardless of what you consented for before, you will have to renew your consent at 10-year periods. This is extremely important for those patients who may have stored for up to 55 years because they were prematurely infertile. How it worked before is the patient would fill their consent form out. They could store for 55 years if they were prematurely infertile. And it would be the clinic's responsibility to fill what's called a medical practitioner's form out every 10 years to allow that sample to be in storage, but the patient didn't actually have to reconsent. Under the new laws, the patient will have to consent at the end of the most recent MPS, that statement that the clinic provided. And that could be 20 years, even more, before the end of what you thought you'd consented for. So I can't stress enough how important it is, if you have sperm, eggs or embryos in storage, to contact your clinic and make sure that there's up-to-date contact information, because you might have moved house or email addresses have changed, and a clinic can only use what they've got. They will try their hardest, I'm sure, to contact you, but it would be very useful for the clinics if you could contact them to update their details. And of course, because of the change in the law, and now you are allowed to use egg, sperm and embryos in the event of the death for a 10-year period, it might be that you wish to reconsent to make use of those new laws. So as I said, I can't say it enough, so I will say it again. It's so important that if you need to stay in touch with your clinic and let them know, because if you don't, and a clinic needs to reconsent you and renew your consent and can't reach you and has no method of getting that, at the end of that 10-year period, that end of that period where they need to contact you, those embryos or gametes or sperm will be taken, that the consent's withdrawn, and they will be removed from storage and disposed of. So it is a real critical thing that you keep in touch with your clinics. The key dates that are really important in this new legislation, and don't worry about these too much, this is what clinics are really getting to grips and understanding at the moment, is the 1st of July 22. We're obviously past that date now, but that's the date, what's called a transitional period, and that's when the new legislation starts. For any patients who consent runs out between the 1st of July 22 and the 30th of June 24, everybody falls within this transitional period. And it doesn't matter when in this 2 years your consent runs out, clinics must though write to you before the 30th of June 23, and they must get your consent in writing before the end of the transitional period, which is the 30th of June 24. If you haven't renewed consent and it ran out during this time, on the 1st of July 24, eggs or embryos will be removed from storage and disposed of. Embryos, they can sit, it's lawful to keep them stored for an extra 6 months, but they can't be used and you can't reconsent during that time. Withdrawal of consent can be done if there's one partner that hasn't, but embryos will then be removed from storage and disposed of at the end of that time. So again, it's stressing, it's really important that you are in touch with your clinic if you've got material in storage. So the key terms to understand is that obviously consent is fundamental for you to keep your egg, sperm or embryos stored, and the consent around that is about what use you're consenting to, so for training purposes, for posthumous use. But then what's also important is the consent period, because this is defined in law. And the consent period now for embryos goes from the day that they were put into storage. So you can consent for up to 10 years, and that is your consent period, that 10 years. You then have to renew consent at 10 years to go forward, and you keep going in that circle until you get to 55 years. For most sperm and eggs, the consent period also begins when it goes into storage. There's a very rare occasions when consent can't be given. For example, if someone's under 18 or lacking capacity at that time. But the majority of time, you've just got to remember that the consent period now starts when your sperm, eggs or embryos goes into storage, not when you sign the consent form. And this is important for the renewal process. So there's a very defined period in law now that says that there's a renewal period 18 months around your consent expiry. So your consent expiry date, remember, is 10 years after it was first placed in storage. So what happens around that is 12 months before your expiry date, the clinic now has to write to you with a notice saying, you know, you've got 18 months, we need to renew your consent if you want to keep it in storage. What's really important is that there's also a dialogue with the clinic. You need information, proper information, the implications of keeping your samples in storage, and you should also be able to have an offer of counselling, because it's, you know, it might be quite a lot to think about whether you want to keep your embryos in storage, whether you want to donate them to training, or you might want to donate them for other purposes. So if you remember that they have to keep renewing your consent every 10 years. At the end of that 18-month renewal period, so that's the renewal period is 12 months before the consent expiry, it lasts 6 months afterwards. If your consent isn't renewed, then the clinic will write to you to say that those sperm, eggs or embryos will be removed from storage and disposed of. So that's just the basics of the sort of fundamentals of the change in the law, but I'm sure we'll be able to have some questions and chat through a few more scenarios and what it means from an implications point of view.
Thank you very, very much, Rachel. That really was very comprehensive. And I think that the slides and the diagrams are also so helpful. I do have a few questions if you're happy to take them, which have come into us. I think the first one is the change in the law, which a lot of hard work went in to achieve the change in the law on the storage times, which took place earlier this year, which is really quite momentous because it's the first change since the Fertility and Embryology Act was enacted 30 years ago. What would you say is the main impact of this change?
I think the main impact now is that everybody can store for the same amount of time. So patients, regardless of whether you're storing for preserving your fertility for your own reasons, for medical reasons, whether you're just undergoing IVF treatment, it really means that everybody can store for the same amount of time. I'm sure many may be aware of a campaign that was for patients that wanted to freeze their eggs to preserve their fertility for later on for social reasons, for example. Now anybody can store, but remember it's all about that 10-year consent. And of course, donors, it means that donors, the accessibility to donors has increased because now donors can store for more than 10 years for anybody requiring donor sperm. So that, you know, that is makes it a lot fairer and even for everybody. I think just to add, the HFEA's role in this is we don't make the legislation, we don't make the rules up. Our job is to make sure that we provide support and help to clinics to help them comply, and then we obviously check compliance against the law. And we have worked very hard with clinics because we've had a short deadline, which again we haven't had any control over to implement this. We have worked hard with clinics to try and explain this so that they can give the correct information to patients.
Yes, I think that is really an appreciated and important point, is that you uphold the law, but you don't make the law, and you're there in the background ensuring and supporting that everybody who needs to know what they have to do are able to do it. And that's an incredibly important and appreciated role. There's also been changes, as you mentioned, in the consent forms, and that was just earlier this month, just a couple of weeks ago, and you've clearly laid those out. But for new couples who are starting out in the IVF clinics, what is their obligation? What should they be expecting from the clinics with regard to these HFEA consent forms? Because of course it's all new to them.
Yeah, I mean, for anybody starting IVF treatment, it is really daunting, and the information that you're given can be overwhelming. And certainly when you're faced with a very lengthy consent form, it is very daunting and hard to understand. And although I've said, you know, it seems very simple that you consent up to 55 years, you just got to renew at 10 years. All the complexities of getting that consent right, especially with the posthumous use, you know, in the event of your death, is so critically important. So it's really important when you doing those forms, that the clinic has provided you with the information that you absolutely understand what you're signing for, what you're agreeing to, and what your wishes you want to translate to in the future. So having the provision of information that so you understand it, but also clinics should offer you a counselling appointment. Sometimes that's really beneficial to go through the consents with and understand the implications. Clinics should also explain exactly that I've explained, that yes, you can store up to 55 years, but you really do need to stay in touch with the clinic because they will have to renew consent every 10 years. So it's like keeping a dialogue open with the clinics as you go along. And they should also give you information about other options such as training and research that might be occurring in the clinic.
That's great. I think that I know from both Chana's perspective and Fertility Network UK that these are questions that we frequently get asked by couples at all stages of the process, and we're very much working closely together to make sure that the couples have that support as well as the support that they're getting from their clinics. And I think part of the conversation here for couples is this is obviously a very daunting and a very difficult process that for many, they never ever imagined this is how they were going to be creating their family. And therefore that adds to, you know, the emotiveness of all of this as well. But coupled with that they're actually being forced to sit and have conversations about subject matter that one wouldn't otherwise have. And so it is really important that all the information is laid out for them. Yeah, in the light of that, I was wondering, should the couples be filling out these forms actually physically in the clinics, or should they be doing this in their own home? At what stage should they be actually completing all these forms?
So good question. And clinics will have different policies and procedures in place. The most important thing, as we've just said, is to make sure that the right information is given to a patient so that the consent is what we call informed and is correct and actually represents the wishes of the patient. Now, quite a few clinics at the moment are moving to what's called electronic consenting, and these are electronic platforms where the consent forms can be filled out is from an individual perspective because you log on to them, and they're actually quite good, some of the platforms, because they give training videos, they discuss the implications of what different sections mean on a consent form before you actually tick it. And then very often the clinics invite the patients to the clinics to sort of sign off those final consents and make sure that there's no questions around that. So in that circumstance, yes, it is appropriate for, you know, the consents to be at home. It may be that paper consents can be done at home, but I would stress that you really need to have been given the information up front or have the opportunity to contact the clinic to have anything explained, because you know they're so important, these consent forms, to get right. So making sure that you understand them and given the right information, whether that's at home or in the clinic, is fine, but make sure that there's time to understand them.
I think that's the point, isn't it? The time, being given the time to do that and really think it through and talk it through.
Yeah, and that's what I said earlier actually about the implications of consent. You know, there's a tick box on the consent form that says, for a woman, would you consent for your partner, a male partner, to use posthumously? It's a simple, you might think, oh yes, that would be great, I'll tick that box, but the implications around that are huge. You have to have all the screening bloods done as a donor, because of course then your embryos are going to be replaced into a surrogate, so that's like a donation. There's extra consent forms to fill out, counselling to have, and there will be costs associated with the donor screening bloods, which can be quite expensive. So although it might seem simple to tick that box, it's not actually, and all those things have to be in place if that's going to be allowed in the future, if anything did happen in the event of, you know, the female's death. So again, that's where it's important not just to tick the boxes at home without fully understanding and being given the right information.
So you mentioned cost. Now, most of the clinics, when people are looking at their invoices or bills, there'll be an £80 payment on the clinic bill that's labelled an HFEA fee. What is that covering?
It's the HFEA, it's not a patient fee at all. It's a license fee that we obviously inspect clinics, we provide information for patients, we go into clinics and we deal with incidents, complaints. So what we do is we charge clinics a fee for every embryo transfer they do and for every donor insemination they do. And then that comes back to the HFEA to cover the costs of our regulation. So some clinics might choose to label that on their bill, but it's not a patient fee to the HFEA at all.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I know you've mentioned it in your presentation, but I think for the purposes of clarity, for couples who are currently in the system, what is their obligation, or is it the clinic's obligation now that the forms have been reissued? So they completed forms at the time that they started their process, however long ago that might have been. But now that the forms have been reissued, are they having to go back to the clinics to re-complete the forms, start over with the forms, or is it the clinic that's going to be reaching out to them? Could you enlighten people what they should expect?
Certainly around renewal of consent, as I described, that is a clinic has a legal responsibility to write to patients at certain times, at the start of the renewal, at the consent expiry. So they have to write to try and engage with the patient to get that renewal done. So absolutely, it is the clinic's obligation to contact the patient around renewal. Clinics will do their very best, and the HFEA will expect them to make all reasonable attempts to contact a patient. But this is where it's important, again, mentioned it earlier, please do update contact information, because if a clinic hasn't got an address, it might be very difficult for them to find it. For patients that are in the middle and not at that renewal time, they might benefit from the posthumous use provisions, this 10-year from the date of death. So clinics, I'm sure, will be going through their material in storage. Some clinics have got thousands and thousands of samples in storage, so it would be impossible to ask everybody to re-consent at once. And it might be that some patients don't need to re-consent at all because, you know, their posthumous provisions is fine and the female doesn't want to pay for surrogacy screening bloods. It's absolutely fine for those consents that will remain lawful until that renewal period. I know some clinics have decided, for example, when they send the yearly storage letters out, to put a paragraph explaining that they will contact them at the renewal, and then that will go onto the new laws. But if they want to consent in the meantime, they can do. Certainly for patients who completed the forms a few months ago, perhaps, because the process of IVF and getting to treatment is quite long, and you know, you might fill your consent forms out, could be 2 or 3 months before you actually get to egg collection, because we know there's always complications sometimes and you can't start a cycle, or the stimulation takes longer than you think. So, but if you consented on an old form before the 1st of July, and you've now frozen embryos or frozen sperm or eggs after the 1st of July 22, we would definitely recommend that you re-consent on new forms for those. And that's because you've frozen your egg, sperm or embryos in the time of the new law. And the consent forms all talk about a 10-year period renewal, whereas the old forms didn't. It was very different. So certainly in those cases, clinics should be asking patients to re-consent. The others, by all means, if you suddenly feel that you want to talk about this, learn more about it, please do contact your clinics. But clinics will certainly have to contact you at the renewal period.
Are the couples likely to incur any costs when renewing these forms? Because that's obviously something that people might be wondering about if they're renewing their forms.
Clinics certainly shouldn't be charging what we've discussed, the HFEA fee for this, because that is per embryo transfer or donor insemination. Clinics do tend to charge a yearly fee for storage, and maybe that includes the consent, the money that might be incurred as a cost for an appointment to fill consents in, counselling. Clinics will have different offers of counselling. There should be a free offer of counselling, but that might be, you might have 1 or 2 free and then have to pay. So clinics will have that defined. If you're filling a consent form for renewal, I would hope there isn't a cost associated with that. But what's important to do is ask your clinic that and make sure you know any costs up front, if there are any. Clinics now have to have very defined cost of treatment plans to make sure that you understand where the costs are. But most clinics do pay a yearly storage fee to keep the embryos in storage, because they have to top up the dewars with liquid nitrogen, they have an on-call rota, the dewars have to be serviced, so it's the costs around that.
I mean, there's a very clear real cost to the clinic, of course. Sure. So for couples who've completed their family, if they have material still stored in the clinics and they're not wanting to use it anymore, what options would be open to them?
I mean, this is a very difficult decision, isn't it, when you've got your embryos left in the freezer. I would recommend obviously seeing about counselling to discuss that and discussing the options, or talking to someone at the clinic. Embryologists can go through what options there are as well. There is the simple option of withdrawing your consent to storage, and the embryos are taken out of the freezer and they're disposed of. Embryos, when they're in the freezer, are in very specialised solutions that the embryologists use to protect them while they're frozen. It actually takes all the water out of the cells, so that they're like very dehydrated. Now, for an embryo to be able to be thawed out and used, you've got to rehydrate the cells, and if you don't do that, the cells break down very quickly. So the way that if you remove them from the freezer and you don't do something with them, the cells just immediately die. It's a very, very quick process, so that can happen. There are also very really good uses that embryos or sperm and embryos can be used. Some clinics do have research licenses and links with research centres, and you can get very good patient information leaflets about individual research projects, and that's something that you consider doing. The other thing you could consent to, and you can consent on the forms, and for embryos you would consent for up to 10 years from the date you sign the form, but you could consider giving those for training purposes as well. It's worth discussing with your clinic and considering the options. In some circumstances, you can donate them for the use of others, but there are constraints around donation. So it depends, for a woman especially, on the age that the eggs and embryos were created and frozen, and there's other tests and things to be done as well, and counselling. So there are options, and I would definitely encourage them to talk through them at the clinic.
Thank you. And I think, just to reiterate again, that both our agencies will have members of our teams that are available to discuss these various different choices, because they are difficult choices, and sometimes couples need quite a long time and possibility to talk these options through, not just with their clinics. You mentioned the training, and on the form there's actually a consent to donate to training. Why is the training so important? What will actually happen, to the eggs or the sperm or even the embryos if they are donated to training?
Yes, well, certainly in a fresh cycle of IVF, we know that not every egg will create an embryo. Not every embryo will continue developing to the stage where it's suitable to be frozen for treatment in the future, or for an embryo transfer. So, for example, some eggs, when the eggs and sperm are put together, just don't fertilise for some reason, and there's no way that they could progress to an embryo. Now, those eggs, for example, are very useful for embryologists to practice the technique for ICSI. So ICSI is a technique for male factor infertility. And instead of just in normal IVF, where you put lots of sperm around the eggs and you leave them to fertilise on their own, if there's not enough sperm to do that, the embryologist will select a sperm and inject it into the centre of the egg. Now, that's quite a technical process to do. It takes a lot of training. So these eggs that can't be used in a patient's treatments are really useful for that. And similarly, if you've got embryos that are developing, or sometimes embryos just stop growing for some reason. It's very often sometimes that the genetics of that embryo isn't quite right and they just stop growing and they wouldn't go on to form a pregnancy, or there's poor quality blastocysts that aren't suitable for freezing. Embryologists, the technique of freezing, what's called vitrification now, is again very technically challenging for embryologists, and they really do need to practice the delicacies of that to get it right. I mean, an embryo, I always say it's 7 times smaller than a full stop. So embryologists are working down a microscope using tiny things that they can't possibly see, and it is very intricate, and the timing is absolutely critical to be able to get these really good survival rates and pregnancy rates after it. And then there's of course biopsy. So sometimes we as embryologists remove some cells from an embryo and test those for genetic diseases, or for testing, just for genetic testing. You might have heard of PGTA. Again, that's really complex technical process an embryologist has to learn. And obviously such precious material, embryologists don't get signed off. There's a very set training program for embryologists where they have to practice and practice and practice, and they're only signed off when they're competent. But we do need eggs and embryos that aren't suitable for your own treatment, or you don't want any more for your own treatment, to be able to get these embryologists to be highly skilled in doing so. If anybody's worried at all, the embryologist, I'm sure in any clinic, would be happy to explain exactly what training they do and how they would use them and what happens to them in any of the processes.
I think that's incredibly helpful, and I think that sometimes we need to be reminded how far the technology has moved. Louise Brown celebrated her 44th birthday. Little did anyone imagine that a single cell could be removed from an embryo, I'm sure, back then. So
yeah. Well, when I started in 1994, and it's certainly very different to what happens in the laboratory now.
Yeah, so I think it's really, really helpful to hear that, straight from the embryologists. I think for a lot of people that puts it into context. Thank you. Moving on to something that I know is a source of concern for many. On these forms, and especially the changes now where posthumous use is discussed and various other really delicate pieces of information, not that the rest of it wasn't quite delicate already, but there's wishes expressed and the like. Who is actually going to see these forms? Where are they going to end up, if you like? Is it just the clinic, or is this information going anywhere else? I think that it would be helpful for people who are having to actually complete these forms to have that understanding, please.
I mean, anybody undergoing medical treatment, whether that's with your GP or in any hospital, expects confidentiality, absolutely. But there is an extra layer of confidentiality around IVF treatment, and fertility clinics, whether they're in an NHS hospital or whether they're in a private hospital or a standalone clinic, all have to abide by the HFEA Act, and it is very defined in there about confidentiality. And for example, patients' records, stay on licensed premises. There's only staff that are competent and trained and know the confidentiality requirements of the HFEA Act that can have access to that. There is a consent form that any patient will come across in the IVF journey, and that's a consent disclosure. And on that form, you can tick who is allowed to see your information. Obviously, staff working in the clinic will need to see that. And it's very useful, for example, for your GP to be able to have that information, or you give consent for somewhere in another department. So for example, if you had another medical complication, it's useful for the IVF clinic to talk to perhaps an expert in that field, but that can only be done with your consent. And that's more the generic issues around the medicine and the care. The actual consent forms will retain in your patient notes and really should only be seen with clinic staff. Potentially they would be seen by a HFEA inspector, who are obviously bound by confidential agreements, because what we do is we go into clinics every 2 years, and part of that we will audit sets of notes to make sure that the clinics are taking consent properly and those consents are accurate. A lot of clinics also take great pride in having their own quality management system and really working to high standards. So they might do quality standards such as ISO, and that might involve an inspector who would be asked to sign a confidentiality agreement and would understand the terms of looking through notes. But again, that's all to do with checking the accuracy and the of consent and how consent is taken in a clinic. So all I would say is be reassured, because confidentiality is really taken seriously within a fertility clinic.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. Sticking with the forms for another moment, if I may, on the consent forms, it asks us to decide what should happen if we die or become mentally incapacitated. On the woman's form, it states that the eggs and the embryos can only be used if further screening and consent forms are done. Why is that only on the woman's form?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, and it's so important though to understand this, because
thank you.
It really is. And I would definitely encourage this as a conversation to have when you fill consent forms out at the clinic. And it's because if you've got a couple and it's a male and a female couple, and the male can consent to his female partner quite easily to use his sperm to create embryos, because the embryos with his sperm is going back to his partner. So they're a couple together. So that's quite easy. But if you think about it the other way round, the man isn't going to be the person having the embryo from his partner inside of him. So there's got to be a way of that pregnancy being carried. And the only reason, the way that that can happen, is for a surrogate to be involved. Now, that surrogate isn't someone who's in a relationship with the partners that created those embryos. So it's seen as donation. So all the screening around the sexually transmitted diseases and other tests that are looked at to make sure that it's safe for the surrogate to carry that pregnancy, it's done as a donation. And this is why the consent forms have been changed recently to make this very clear, that if a woman consents for posthumous use, they've got to undertake the screening. And that might cost, £1,000 extra. So it's something you've really got to consider. And in most events, it hopefully wouldn't be needed. But it is a consideration, and it's this difficult conversation that you need to have. And then there's consent forms. And only when all those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are put together for a woman dying, and it has to be done before death, can then a man undertake that with a surrogate.
Yeah. And of course, all of this is really about thinking about the unthinkable, and nobody wants to do that. And therefore, we really are working so hard to put as much support in place for people when they're having to make these difficult decisions and have these very difficult conversations. Yeah. Again, I'm sorry to repeat something that you mentioned earlier, but I do think it's so important. What happens if we don't receive any notification or any contact from the clinic asking for renewal of consent? What's the obligation?
Yeah, by law, the clinic, and it is absolutely important, this, it's the clinic has a legal obligation to contact the patients, but they can only do that with the information that they've got. So if you think your embryos are coming up, or anything in material is coming up to renewal, or you've got material in storage, it would be well worth contacting your clinic, because we do know most clinics perhaps will send it registered post, but we do know letters go missing. Clinics will try to contact patients every year perhaps, but then sometimes patients just don't reply. If consent isn't renewed, this is really different now in the law. It's taken that consent from the patients is actively withdrawn. So it means that if renewal of consent doesn't occur, the clinic takes it as withdrawn, and it means that they have to, by law, take them out of storage and dispose of them. So it's this: keep in touch with your clinic and make sure that they know what contact details you've got. And if you are going to work abroad for a certain amount of time, make sure that email contact is there, or phone. Just make sure you keep it up to date, because clinics don't want to dispose of material if patients want to keep it. but by law they have to.
That's really, really important. Thank you for clarifying that. So, you know, it's really up to the clinics to reach out, but if for any technical reason they don't, the couples have to be aware of just getting straight back in touch with the clinics. You know, sometimes with all the goodwill in the world, the technology doesn't always work in our favor. I've just got a slightly different question now, which is really relating to donors, because we've talked a lot about couples who have made embryos or in the throes of treatment or planning treatment. And really, my last question is about the donors. Because they can now store for 55 years. And are there any implications for a patient selecting a donor who might have stored their sperm sample for that long, for that, you know, that many years of storage? Are there any implications or anything that the patient should be thinking about?
I think there is, really, and this is something that we've talked about with the British Infertility Counselling Association, for example, because I think there is a lot of implications about donors being able to store for long periods of time now. And it's really to do, I think, with the donor conceived individuals, not to do with the treatment at the time, because we know sperm and eggs and embryos can remain in liquid nitrogen in the freezer, the way that it's frozen, for many, many years, and it would never alter in quality. So it doesn't have implications for the success of your own treatment. But I think the implications for potential children is quite profound, because we know that donor conceived individuals, knowing that the heritage, where the donor, you know, about their donors, is so important to them. And in 2005, the law changed in the UK to allow donor conceived individuals at 18 to find their identity of their donor.
Next year.
Yes, yeah, coming up quickly. And that's a real important milestone, because we know that that's a huge benefit for those donor conceived children to find out. Now, if a donor, say he became a donor at 30 and that was stored for 55 years, you know, you could be using the sperm at 80, and then you've got another 18 years for that sperm, that then donor individual.
Almost eliminated the possibility, haven't you?
So, you know, it's about the importance of a donor individual that's been conceived through finding out who the donor is and having that relationship. But also, one of the also that can happen before you're 18 is that there's donor sibling link, and you can reach out and meet your donor siblings. And if the donor's been installed a long time, there might be huge generational gaps between those donor siblings. So I think it's certainly a question to talk through in the counselling when you are selecting a donor. I would say that most donors won't be kept that long, because a lot of donors reach there. In the UK, we're only allowed to create 10 families per donor. So donor sperm doesn't tend to remain in the storage for a long period of time, because those families are used quickly. And also, say, the demand for donor eggs, we know that there is a demand there, so they tend to get used up. So I would think it would be quite rare for samples to be kept in storage for very long periods of time, but it's certainly worth asking the question.
Thank you for that. I think it's really a whole other conversation, possibly for another time. But I think that, as you say, the scarcity of material now, especially, may be more acute than it was a while ago. But nonetheless, it is something that has an impact, and there's far-reaching implications for, as you say, the donor conceived individuals potentially.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned earlier on that you've got an amazing support facility for patients and information, but also, you know, the HFEA does have its own website, and there is a lot of information on there for patients to consider. There's a lot about implications when you're using donors. There's also lots about treatment and questions you should thinking about when you do consent, and it goes through different consents that you have to do, and that, so it is well worth having a look at the HFEA website for information before you start, you know, even before you start going to a clinic.
Absolutely. Rachel, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Veronique, as well. It was really, really lovely to do a joint webinar with Chana this evening, and I'm sure it's something we'll be doing more of in the future. And Rachel, that was so comprehensive that we don't have a single question, because I think you've answered everything that anyone could possibly want to know about this.
I will sure there'll be more. And as I said, what's absolutely, if there's one thing you take home from tonight or when you listen to it again, is please engage with your clinic and talk all these implications through, and really make sure that you understand those consent forms. No questions silly. That's what the clinic's there for, to support and guide you through it. So there's always more questions, I'm sure.
And I just wanted to echo what you said about the information on the HFEA website. There's an awful lot of information there, which is incredibly useful. And both Chana and Fertility Network are here to support you as well. We've actually got a fact sheet on our website for anyone who might be considering what to do with remaining embryos, which might be really helpful. So do have a look at that. Our next webinar next week is on a very different subject. It's actually on how yoga can help fertility patients relax and why that might be a good thing. So a very different subject indeed. But I just wanted to end by saying, please do get in touch with either of us if you need any help at all. You can find information about both of us through our websites, and find about everything we can do to support you. So thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Veronique. And we wish you a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.